We'll be here with Felipe Cruz from DeJusticia, which is one of the leading human rights organizations in Colombia and who works with affected populations and who will be speaking to the Colombian example, and then we'll move on to the rest. So, bienvenido, Luis. Adelante.
Thank you, Zara. Thanks to all the organizations that have been this possible, and I want to thank also to the Colombian Vice Minister of Justice and all of you, because we are very glad, because after a long period of huge efforts, Colombia is discussing finally important reforms on criminal and drug policy laws. As you know, drug policy in Latin America has focused on an expansive and disproportionate sentencing wave of different laws and so many restrictions in the applications of alternatives to incarcerations for drug offenses. And this mix has resulted in an uncontrolled increase in the what we have called sobredosis carcelaria overdose, prison overdose. Here there is a publication, a release that we made 3 years ago. Of course, Colombia hasn't been immune to this trend of over-criminalization, and which has directly affected the youth population and women, as Vice Minister Umaña pointed yesterday in a meeting. Criminalization of the woman for drug offenses is immersed in a context of social marginalization, economic inequality, and an inequitable distribution of care duties. Women who become involved in drug offenses tend to have a specific profile, which doesn't correspond to the stereotype of the cartel boss. On the contrary, women are mostly poor and housekeepers and living in the neighborhoods with a high incidence of drug markets. A census published by the UNODC and Ministry of Justice in 2021 concluded that 41% of the women who were deprived of their liberty in Colombia are in jail for drug crimes. In most cases, these crimes are non-violent crimes. So, according to the information published by the Ministry of Justice, half of the part of the women who were in prison for drug offenses were also in circumstances in which they didn't have support in their families to care for the children. 75% had informal jobs, and all these contexts end up leading women to become involved as human carriers, small-scale vendors, operators of other low-level taxes. The incarceration of women has not made an improvement in public security, nor has it contributed to solving the enormous challenge that we face in Colombia related with armed groups. The working group on drug policy, women and incarceration, led by IDPC and WOLA, have come a long way in advocating for Latin American states to adopt good practices and move towards abandoning the extreme punitivisms in the implementation of drug policies. And we are very pleased with the enactment of the Colombian law last week that created a public utility services as an alternative to incarceration for women, heads of households that can serve their conviction through providing social service. The woman will be able to provide this service with the supervision of a judge and in the company of the Ministry of Justice for a maximum of 20 hours per week. The service will be provided in public entity, non-profit organizations, and NGOs. That institutions have to meet all the requirements that the Ministry of Justice will establish in regulations. The great advance of this law is that allows a woman convicted of drug offenses to benefit from this alternative to prisons. And it also seeks to promote a gender and care approach. In Colombia, people who are convicted of drug offenses must go to prison, since the only measures available to these crimes is conditional release, which involves being in prison for a period of approximately 36 months. So it's a great news that I have to share with you. I do believe that it is very important that the regulation of this law allowed us to collect the good practices and lessons learned from the implementation of the amnesty law passed in Mexico in 2020. The purpose of this law was to benefit persons deprived of their liberty who are in a situation of vulnerability and facing legal and justice system. Unlike other alternatives to incarceration, this law in Mexico allows ending the criminal action, not only suspending it. According to the information collected by my colleagues at Elementa, since the law came into the force in April of 2020, until this day, 244 people have been amnestied, and 93 of them were women. I think the results could be better, but I think the Mexican government is improving that implementations. I would like to end my intervention by calling all the states taking part in these sessions of the CND to deepen the reforms surrounding the use of imprisonment to address the war drug situation. In particular, the adoption of alternative measures to incarcerations that respect the rights and care work performed by the women who go to prison for drug offenses. At least in Colombia, we really need a deeper conversations of the use of criminal justice in drug policy, not only in traffic offenses, but the criminalization of coca small growers, which is related with the implementation of the substitution plan of the peace agreement, and the end of all administrative sanctions included in the police code that affects the people who use drugs. Thank you very much. You can take any book if you want.
Thank you very much, Luis Felipe. You're bringing up several very important points about what are the reforms that can happen to begin to move towards what effective decriminalization looks like, or alternatives to an incarceration model. We're now going to watch a short video that we have from Lynn Ulbricht, who is the mother of Ross Ulbricht. He was the founder of the Silk Road. He is currently serving 2 life sentences plus 40 years. To put this in context a bit, when we think about El Chapo Guzman from Mexico, he's currently serving 1 life sentence. So this was a person who created a platform, an online platform, which was then used to distribute drugs. He didn't have any personal involvement in the distribution of these drugs, but because he was framed as this large-scale criminal who was pushing forward this initiative. Obviously, since then, lots of other Silk Roads and/or other online platforms have emerged. This is another consequence, and we see this all the time, of the flexibility, the diversity of the illegal market, and the capacity to move much more quickly than others, and so than states and governments. So he was really used as an example, and he's being used as an example of criminalization as a means to deter others from doing something similarly. So we're going to hear from his mother, who obviously is feeling the impacts of this. And I think that Luis Felipe also highlighted it in his presentation. When you incarcerate a person, you are not only incarcerating that person, you are also sentencing their family and their community to deal with the impacts, whether that's because it's their mother, their grandmother, their father, their son, etc. So this is where we're really seeing the impacts of prohibition on whole communities.
Hello, I'm Lynn Ulbricht. My son, Ross Ulbricht, is serving a double life plus 40-year sentence without parole for all nonviolent convictions. This is a death in prison sentence. The day I heard the judge pronounce that brutal sentence on my son, whom I love with all my heart, was the most terrible day of my life. He was just 31 years old and had no criminal history. His adult life was just beginning, and he was being locked away as irredeemable. Eventually, my shock and grief led to a heart condition, which put me in the hospital where I almost died. Having your loved one condemned to die in prison has a huge impact in so many ways, and it ripples out into the family and community. It's like having them executed, which is kind of true, as they are indeed being buried alive. This all began when Ross was 26 years old. An idealistic young man full of ideas, he created an e-commerce website called Silk Road. It was similar to eBay, only it ran through an anonymous browser and only accepted Bitcoin as payment. The site adhered to the non-aggression principle and forbade anything that used force. It was meant to be a voluntary, anonymous marketplace where willing adults could buy and sell what they wanted as long as it didn't hurt a third party. This meant that some things were strictly prohibited. For example, no child pornography was allowed, nor were violent services, weapons, or anything that used force. Nothing like that was permitted to be sold. However, drugs, both hard and soft, were permitted and sold on the site, most commonly small amounts of marijuana. When Ross was arrested, the site was taken down. Although he was not charged with selling drugs himself, was a first-time offender with all nonviolent convictions, he was given that sentence of 2 lifetimes plus 40 years. That's about 2 centuries. As Ross told me, "Mom, it's a death sentence. It just takes longer." After Ross's arrest, my life totally changed, and I was propelled into another world, alien to anything I had known before. I knew nothing about prison life or the criminal justice system, but since then I've experienced it up close and personal. I've spent years following Ross to various prisons throughout the country. I've spoken to struggling families, heard their tragic stories of shattered lives and damaged children. I've seen those children clinging to their fathers, pried away wailing, leaving the visiting room in tears, shattered. These same children are statistically destined to also end up in prison, continuing this horrible cycle. I remember one mother who lamented how, since her husband was given life, things were falling apart at home. Before his arrest, their kids were getting straight A's and never in trouble, despite the hardships of raising them in a rough New York City neighborhood. Now they were acting out and failing. She didn't know how she would hold it together. She felt hopeless. Hers is just one of countless such stories. Of course, the prisoner's suffering is terrible too. In his essay titled "Who Deserves This?", Ross wrote about the torture of the endless years in prison, spirits crushed, hope abandoned. He described how he asked several of his fellow prisoners to imagine the worst torture they could think of, flogging, burning, whatever, and to say whether they would take that for a limited time or they would prefer staying in prison unharmed for years or decades. They all said, without hesitation, "Give me the physical torture over this." Ross will turn 39 this month and is serving his 10th year in prison. He's a very different person than the reckless, idealistic young man who created that website years ago. He has matured, taken responsibility for what he did, and understands that his actions can have very severe consequences on himself and others. He knows he would never break the law again. Instead, he wants to make a positive difference in the world and benefit others, and is doing his best to do that, even from prison. Yet, unless something changes, he won't get that chance. Parole was abolished in 1987 in the U.S. federal system. so there is no longer the chance to make amends or prove you've changed. No matter how draconian your sentence, or how societal attitudes have evolved, no matter how much you've grown and proven yourself, if you're in a federal prison, you are permanently condemned, short of clemency from the President of the United States. And Ross is not unique. 1 out of every 7 prisoners is serving life in the United States. This is more than ever in the history of this country. Since the 1980s, the number of people in prison overall has metastasized 800%, from less than 200,000 to 1.4 million. Thousands of them are serving extreme sentences, far beyond what fits their crime. Over half of these are nonviolent drug offenders. According to the ACLU, at least 70 people are serving life for nonviolent marijuana charges. Ross was friends in prison with one named Tony. Before he was commuted by President Trump, Tony was serving life for pot in a federal prison in Colorado, all while it was legal on the state level and dispensaries were open for business. Every day that passes, my family and I pray that Ross will be given a commutation from the President, the opportunity to be free again and raise a family with his fiancée. He poses no threat to society. On the contrary, he has so much to contribute. Like thousands of others serving excessive sentences, he should have a second chance. As Ross once wrote, pain does not heal pain. A lost soul is not redeemed in a cage. To learn more about Ross and his case, and to sign the petition, please visit freeross.org. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
So that gave us a sense of what people are suffering through and their families. So we're going to go on with Neil now. Neil Woods is part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and which is a space and an organization that has been sometimes behind the criminalizing, well, not the organization, but people who have served in law enforcement finding a way to talk about this, to be able to bring a voice that what many of you dedicated your lives to is not working. And so how do we make those big changes? Which is one of those very important voices, yours, people who've had children who have been, who have had drug overdoses, people who have children who've been disappeared because of the war on drugs, mothers like Lynn Ulbricht, these voices that are so important to be able to understand the dynamics and how do we disrupt the status quo. Thank you, Neil.
Yeah, thank you, Zara. Yes, I'm part of the Law Enforcement Action Partnership, and we are the leaders of the growing worldwide movement of police and other law enforcement figures who are campaigning for an evidence-based drug policy. And all of my fellow elite members have some kind of personal story, some kind of reason that we've realised that we were only causing harm, not just to individuals but to communities. And that brings us to the topic today. Now, I think one of the things that we're most useful for at LEAP is that we can explain the reality of actually what the cops get up to, and actually the mechanisms of what we use in our investigations. And the most important tool that we use is the use of informants, people to grass up the drug dealers. And 95% of the information from police informants is about drugs. So it's a war on drugs tactic, it's a prohibition tactic to use this information. Now, if someone gets caught with drugs and they're waiting in their police cell, they know that 2 detectives are going to come in through that cell door and offer them a deal. And quite often that deal that's being offered is a reduction in the prison sentence. And this is a universal tactic right across the world. And where police have big sentences to threaten with, it makes them very happy because it puts more pressure on them. So that person who sat in the police cell, who's thinking, I can't face this many years, I've got to do a deal with these detectives, I've got to give them some information, they're thinking to themselves, who am I least scared of? Who can I provide information about to the police that's not going to get me killed or even tortured? Who is there out there that I can, there must be someone I know that's not that dangerous. And so that process, that thinking process of what information to give to the police, creates a commodity of fear on the streets. This is what creates the Darwinian situation out there, where the most violent and the most ruthless are the most successful. Because that commodity of fear means that you've got to be strong enough to intimidate that man sat in that cell, wondering who is safest for him to grass up. That's what is driving the violence. I think it's the most significant driver of the violence in our communities. Now, I remember working undercover, and I'd been manipulating this particular vulnerable person, and he was introducing me to various gangsters. And he got arrested. And I thought, oh no, this is terrible. He's not going to get bail. I'm going to have to start working in somebody else. Then I saw him. I was with some of companions of his, and he came out, and I said, hang on, you just got caught on bail with a load of heroin. How did you get released? And he says, well, it was terrible, because the cops came in and they said, you're going to have to give us some information, or we're going to tell everybody that you did. And I said, well, wow, that's terrible. So what did you do? What did you do? And he says, well, I couldn't give them any information, could I? They might be working with the same person I'm working for. So this insidious threat of violence is created by the system of gathering intelligence through police informants. And this happens in every country domestically, but it also impacts on the growth and the power of transnational organised crime, because the biggest gangs are the ones that win. In particular, because of our on a delegate from Colombia, I'm making reference to the relationship in that regard between the United States and Colombia. Because the United States routinely captures poor fisher people from Colombia, and they get arrested, and there's no detailed records published of how many Colombians are in American jails serving huge sentences. But we do have some allies and friends in the United States. So my good friend Kendra Sweeney over there gave me a list from 2 years that her university's looked at of lists of Colombians which are serving between 10 and 18-year prison sentences. So it's only for 2 years, and you can speak to Kendra to get more information. But my point is that every single person on this list, probably a poor person, more than likely coerced into doing what they were doing by organised crime, every single one of these huge prison sentences on this list, 18 years, 10 years, whatever it is, it represents the intimidation of their families in their communities back home. Because in response to what police do in offering deals, organised crime take that out on families. Because you're not likely to take a deal to reduce your prison sentence if your family is under threat. So that is the reality of this list. And it is generally poor people. And I have to say, from speaking from a law enforcement perspective, cops who are engaged in this with great enthusiasm, they want those prison sentences large to put that pressure on, and it stokes the war. So we need to be understanding these mechanisms and use the knowledge of that mechanism to advocate for change. So I've got that list, but I can introduce you to Kendra afterwards.
And I think you bring up this confluence of state violence and non-state actors' violence, and so then communities and people are stuck between those two. There is no space to maneuver, and I think communities that cultivate also feel that either the government's going to eradicate your crops, or organized criminal gangs are going to, require you to sell to them. So there's this very thin space that people are allowed to function in, which tends to be a space of survival more than anything else. And so how does that impact families is also very important. And since you brought up, what this is doing in the United States, and those people who are, this is a global perspective, but obviously we also know that many of these policies began in the United States, that there was this idea of minimum sentencing, mandatory minimums, And so now I'm very happy to have Theshia Naidoo from Drug Policy Alliance, which is the leading drug policy reform organization in the United States, to really give us this framing around the United States. Thank you.
Thank you, Zara, and thanks for having me be a part of this really important conversation. So just to provide some historical context for disproportionate sentencing in the United States, more than 50 years ago, U.S. President Nixon declared a war on drugs, making drug use public enemy number one. And this has resulted in intensifying law enforcement responses and an over 1,000% increase in the state prison population for drug offenses within a 30-year period. And over the years, the sentencing has been enhanced and become increasingly punitive. So with this escalating penalties and mandatory minimum sentences imposed for drug offenses. This has resulted in disproportionately severe sentences for drug offenses and tremendous racial disparities in the system. When you look at the data on people who are involved in drug offenses and certainly in the drug trade, they span all segments of society, but the ones that are most harshly criminalized come largely from marginalized communities. Those individuals who may be using drugs, people living in poverty, women, non-citizens, and people of color. I mentioned that statistic earlier. And often they have roles at the lowest rung of the drug supply chain. So I can just briefly do some highlights. I know we don't have too much time and we want some questions, but regarding people who use drugs, the law tends to want to separate people who use drugs from people who sell drugs. But the reality, when you look at the data, most people caught up in selling offenses are also ones that use drugs. So there's this overlapping identity or individual, but the law treats them different, with one given leniency in terms of drug use and in terms of sales, having harsh sentences imposed. Laws against drug selling are written so broadly that even people who never engage in a drug sale are caught up and labeled as drug dealers. In terms of people living in poverty, a lot of times, based on our criminal justice system and certainly the drug laws in the United States, some people are actually prohibited from even entering the formal economy. Based on your criminal conviction, you're denied an opportunity to get an education, or employers will be unlikely to hire you because you have this criminal conviction. And so people living in poverty sometimes have no meaningful way to earn a meaningful living, and they turn to sales in order to meet basic subsistence needs. I mentioned people of color. While the data is very clear that drug sales, drug use rates are equivalent across racial groups, people of color are searched, stopped, convicted, arrested, and sentenced for drug offenses at far higher rates than white people in the United States. And the fact that people of color are more likely to be the ones locked up in prison for these offenses reinforces this racist stereotype that these are the communities that are most engaged or involved in drug trade. Just quickly turning to women, and I know my co-panelists talked about women in Colombia. Likewise, women in prisons in the United States are also overrepresented in terms of drug selling. They frequently, under the conspiracy laws in the United States, if they live with a partner, a male partner who may be involved in drug selling, the simple act of taking a phone message or passing on information gets them caught up in these conspiracy laws, and a lot of women are spending time for lengthy periods for drug selling offenses, even if they weren't actually involved in any kind of drug selling. Quickly on, looking also at prison data from official sources in the United States, the vast majority of people involved in drug trade in the U.S. are low level, and the mandatory minimum offenses have been imposed in the United States with the at least the thinking behind having these mandatory minimums is that they're going to go after the big fish, they're going to go after the kingpins. But the data actually shows that mandatory minimums apply much broadly and doesn't go after these high-level actors in the system. And in fact, most of the people currently serving time for selling offenses are really the lowest level of the drug trade. So just, looking at the past few decades and increasing penalties, I mean, there have been, some reforms, so I will turn to that shortly. But what we're also seeing is that despite these tremendous sentences, drug use rates have not declined, availability of drugs is still as ever, available as they have previously. And we have an unprecedented overdose crisis in the United States. But despite that, some states are doubling down and they're trying to increase penalties for certain drug offenses, with the hopes that if we throw more punishment at the problem, that somehow we're going to address the overdose crisis. And what we're seeing is that that's not happening. So I will just pause there and say, despite this increasing punitive trend of the last several decades, there have been some reforms, and civil society has been pushing that very strongly in the United States. We have some alternatives. I'm happy to ask, present them during the Q&A, but one thing I will say is that there's been a growing movement to decriminalize drug possession and drug use in the US. The state of Oregon was the first one in 2000 to actually formally adopt a decriminalization policy. And the lessons learned from passing that decrim policy is that, in trying to build a strong, inclusive movement, it's really important to make those connections between drug policy and housing rights and social justice and racial justice, because it's clear that systemic injustice really is targeting some of the more marginalized groups in the society. And when you make the connection, for example, with a housing rights advocate, it's like, yeah, you're working for housing, access to housing, but do you realize that as a result of a drug conviction, people are prevented from having access to housing? And so making those connections between various issues in terms of educational rights, anti-poverty, housing, I think building an inclusive movement where all those other individuals can be calling for reforms on the drug policy space, because it really has lasting impacts in other systems as well. So I'll pause there and look forward to questions.
Oh, thank you so much. And this is, I think, what we all see in drug policy reform. How is it intersectional with other rights that need to be guaranteed, and the reparations that would need to be made, following some sort of excarceration. So now we have the honor of having the Vice Minister of Criminal Policy and Restorative Justice from Colombia, Camilo Eduardo Umaña, and we look forward to hearing maybe some hope, some light of what could come. Thank you.
Hopefully, thank you. Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me. When we start discussing about disproportionate sentencing, we might have a broader question in hand. We might think that this could be focused on the judicial system or the justice system, but maybe, as you just suggested, the question is more about the lack of justice in the general social system. We have to acknowledge that there is something happening previously from sentencing, before sentencing, which refers to the design of the laws, the institutional framework, and also who are the clients of this system, the poor people, the people more marginalized. I go every week to a different prison in Colombia. We have 127 prisons in Colombia, and I've met a lot of people who are there because of drug trafficking or in different ways. I haven't met anyone that is in prison because being the big brain of a money laundering operation. I haven't met. But I have met a lot of people who are there because of smuggling or or different chains of the drug trafficking industry, let's say. There's also a question on what happens after sentencing. What happens to the families, what happens to the communities, what happens to the stigma that communities suffer based on this criminalization. Even the country itself, the whole population, when we go abroad, we have a sort of sentence that we have to be punished all together because of this issue, because of this problem. So the stigma is also a part of this question of the disproportionate sentencing. Three main effects I experience in the legal system, in the Colombian legal system. The first is against women. So most of women, at least 30%, are there because they are in prison because of drug trafficking issues. And these women, at least 57% are heads of households, have their kids at home, and these women, most of them come from very poor environments and contexts. The other impact I witness is the impact on youngsters. 70% of youngsters that are in the adolescent youngster responsibility tribunals are there because of drug trafficking issues. But not only because of that, some of them have health issues because they don't have any other opportunities in their context. So they start consuming, and at some point they are criminalized. So last week I went to Cali, to one of these centers, and they said to me, we need something else to do. We don't have any options, we don't have any opportunities. We started consuming because that was the only offer from anyone in our communities. And those people end up in the criminal system. And the other effect that I've witnessed is the effect on the disproportionality on the attack or the emphasis of the criminal system. So the criminal system has emphasized, at least in Colombia, on micro trafficking, but not on the stronger chains of command of drug trafficking industries and these gangs that affect the security not only of the country but of the region and perhaps of the world. So what to do? We are taking 2 steps forward. So first is a proposal, a bill that we have passed, that we are trying to pass through the Congress, that is called Humanizing the Criminal Policy. It has different restorative measures within, but also one of the articles that I want to focus on is about suspending the punishment or the deprivation of liberty of those people, especially peasants who are vulnerable and are in a substitution program. They could not be sent to prison because we are sending a contradictory message. You come to the state, we give you a program to substitute your crops, and at the same time, if the general attorney says so, they can prosecute you. So this is a contradiction that we need to arrange in our criminal system. There are 2 controls of that possible measure, which are the control of the judge, but also the administrative control that needs to take those people into the program. So we have created a control mechanism. The general attorney in Colombia has criticized extensively this measure, saying that we want to give amnesty to the drug trafficking gangs, and this is not the case. We want not to criminalize poor and marginalized people that are so vulnerable that don't have any other choice. That's what we want to do through this control measure. The other measure that we are taking further is the new law that you just mentioned, the law about restorative measures with regards to women who are sentenced to to deprivation of liberty of minor or below 8 years. Non-violent crimes, most of these women are there because of micro-trafficking issues. And these women are going to be able to replace or substitute the deprivation of liberty by working or community work, trying to bring about, again, a concept of care to the community, but also trying not to break down the relations with their kids, with their family members, and trying to build trust with the society. I have discussed a lot this when it was just a bill, and now it is a law, with different women. And I've told them, listen, if one of you or a group of you fail, if you get again into the business, or if you fail somehow, this will be there will be a low chance to keep this law and these policies in force. This is because there is a lot of resistance, opposition towards all that has to do with alternative or restorative justice. There are a lot of groups, a lot of people who are supporting this in Colombia, but there is also a very conservative and punitive way. So this, we have to deal with this and to think about how can we advance with these difficulties and obstacles as well. Let me finish by sending a message. If all of you are worried about these effects of sentencing, disproportionate sentencing, if all of us agree that we need to do something about it, in Colombia we're trying to do something about this. There is an opportunity. If we can actually implement, for instance, this law about women, we can bring an effective action to fight against the ineffectiveness of disproportionate sentencing. Please join hands with us. Help us to design, to think about these programs. We have 6 months to implement these programs, to make them effective, to translate them into reality. Please, if you come from any institution, reach out. From any government, any multilateral party, please reach out. And here we need ideas, we need cooperation, we need human resources, we need financial resources. If we are going to say that this kind of measures make sense, you have here in Colombia an ally. Please, let's do it together. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Viceministro. I think we have time to take 2 questions, so we could take them to the panel and then we can close. Do we have 2 questions? I see them. Yeah? Go ahead, and then if somebody else wants to think of it. Okay, perfect. So we'll go to you. Yeah.
Hi, my question is for the Colombian speakers. So for the program you mentioned about women being able to access alternative sentencing in the form of community work, will they be paid for that work? And also, is the approach to that program one where they're put under surveillance, and also because I think a lot of social services too in Singapore, where I'm from, there's in so many parts of the world, mimic systems of policing and surveillance, and they set people up for failure. Right? If people are out in the community, they have expenses, but if they're not paid or they don't have labor rights and other kinds of protections, then we're setting them up for kind of going back to doing things that they need to do to get money. Right? So I'm curious about sort of some of the details of that program and how you're thinking about setting people up for success, because you talked about talking to the women, to encourage them to make it work so that you can validate the program and it can continue. But often people are, as we all know, just responding to material conditions. So how are you designing the program to set them up for success?
Thank you.
My question is directed to you. You mentioned something really interesting about mandatory minimums and how it's really contributed to the problem in the US. I'm just wondering, as I'm aware, there's a sentencing commission in the US, and I'm wondering if, in your knowledge, they've done anything about mandatory minimums in general.
Okay, excellent. So ustedes primero y después Theshia, and then
Okay.
conclusions.
Okay, will they be paid? So this is one of the big questions that we have to solve now. But since as I mentioned, there are many vulnerabilities, we cannot forget that when we are going to implement this kind of programs. In Colombia, we have just created a program that gives subsidies to women who are households heads. This means that we have a chance to include part of this program within these subsidies. It is true that not every woman has this issue concretely, but a big part of the women do have this issue. So we're trying to build this subsidy to see if part of this subsidy goes to that. But also there is a limit for the social work that they have to do, which means that they can have the time also to work and to be with their family. This is not completely ideal or extensive. It's going to need some adaptations. But if you have any ideas on how to create a sustainable measure for this, I would be happy to receive it. And what kind of control they have. The idea is that they don't lose, or the judicial system doesn't lose the possibility of controlling and making them, or creating obligations about presenting to court and so on. But also, more than control, we have the idea of interinstitutional assistance. So this person needs to meet with different institutions to see what are the vulnerabilities, but also to have this sort of, let's say, social policy control. So the idea is that they have to, through their work, through the community work, the community is also part of the measures. So in that sense, is a restorative measure also.
I just want to add what the Vice Minister has answered, that I think it's very important to discuss the possibility to give any payment or something that a woman who just be released from the prisons because their family, their economy is almost full harm. They were the home and the family is suffering a lot of injustice So I think this is one of the big issues related with the regulation of this bill. But I think there are a middle ground responses. At least some institutions that will be able to give a place for this woman could pay any kind of money, but this money cannot be considered as a payment because the law itself doesn't contemplate the social service as a labor.
Yes.
So this is a big obstacle in the law, in the redaction, in the legal text.
Because I know the next side event people have already. Do you want